Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
It's election time, and for voters in Maryland's 1st Congressional District, there's one candidate who's returning to the field. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Allison Galbraith is taking her second shot at winning the Democratic primary to challenge Republican incumbent Andy Harris. Galbraith made a run 2 years ago and came in second behind Jesse Colvin in the Democratic primary. But much has changed for the impeachment of the president and contentious presidential race. And we have her in our studio this morning. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So, why make the second run?
Well, so since the 2018 election, I stayed involved. This is my backyard. I do care. I ran for party officer. I was elected the second vice chair of the Maryland Democratic Party. My focus there has been making sure that our party is treating the rural areas of the state with the respect and appreciation that they deserve. Just because we're less densely populated doesn't mean we're any less important. When you look at the numbers, some of the voter registration numbers and GOP outpacing the Democrats through the 12 counties in District 1 suggest eventually Maryland goes purple. Or maybe you've seen the polling showing Hogan beating Senator Van Hollen. And I looked at the longer, bigger picture implications of what would happen if we're not competing here with a solid race, with a solid contender every single cycle, and eventually it just erodes into not being able to win any race anywhere on the ballot that's touching District 1. That to me was horrifying. Beyond that, Harris does not deserve a free pass. He's never deserved a free pass. He's not doing his job, even in the most basic sense. So he deserves to have a challenger. He deserves to have somebody who will go after him on his record.
How do you compare, for instance, you bring up Hogan. How do you compare Hogan to Harris?
They're a totally different beast. Harris is not even remotely reasonable on basically any issue. He might tell you he is. He might say in his social media, oh, well, I voted for this, or this is why I did this. But when you actually know what he's doing, he is flat out lying to people about the impacts of his policies and what they would do.
Such as?
He touts healthcare, for instance, all the time. He's a doctor. He's an obstetric anesthesiologist. He talks about healthcare all the time and how he's expanding healthcare and he's making it cheaper. What he is doing is making it easier for the health insurance companies to deny people based on, again, what we had seen before, pre-existing conditions, gender, all sorts of things. I mean, I got into politics because I asked him about gender rate hikes in 2017 and said, I'm a small business owner. I started this small business because my mom had had a series of strokes. I'd been laid off. Employers don't want to deal with caregiving obligations, this and that. And the only thing, I was in the middle of a divorce, had lost access to my spouse's health insurance policy. The only reason I could own a business at that point in my life, and it was the only thing giving me the flexibility to take care of my mother, especially as a single mom, was that the Affordable Care Act said you can't deny people based on gender. They used to charge women 30 to 80% more for the same policy, which didn't even cover maternity. And you can't deny based on pre-existing conditions, which in my case was pregnancy. I'd had a child. That was it. And I finally meet the guy after 4 months, and I ask him if he'll vote against gender rate hikes, any legislation for ACA replacement, which allows for gender rate hikes. And he looks at me and he says, well, I don't think most people would mind if women paid a little more for health insurance. I don't know if he knows that most people are women or that women are people. It raises some questions. But you look at his legislation, 30% of what he co-sponsors is attacking women's reproductive rights. So you want us to have all these kids, but you're also going to charge us more for health insurance on the basis that we're able to have all of these kids? And then you're going to go and do things like cut the food stamp program You're gonna dilly-dally on making sure that CHIP is funded. It's obscene, the things that he does, but the way that he sells it, his messaging, if you're not digging below the surface, you wouldn't see that there's actually an issue there. 30 to 40% of his time on top of that is spent actually pushing for legislation which chips away at people's ability to receive health care. In a rural area in particular, and there are plenty of rural areas in District 1, some areas you don't even have an urgent care center. People are ending up in the ER for an ear infection, having to drive 45 minutes, things like that. Basic economics says they're going to price gouge you if you only have one area in one place that you can go in a very large area, because it's supply and demand. And he ought to know that if they're the party of, private industry is best for this. There are some things where profit motive is simply not aligned with what's good for people.
One of the things, by the way, he touts, and we saw it again this session as well, that he supports full funding for the Chesapeake Bay Restoration Program, something that the president has often tried to either zero out or certainly cut to the point of almost extinction. So he can come and say, I support the environment, I support the Bay. Do you disagree with that?
I think his record on environment is slightly better than his record on other areas, which is often that he totally opposes what's best for the people that he represents. With regard to the Bay funding, I think it would be insane for him not to sign on to these letters where you have the other Democrats that represent us in Congress all signed on saying protect the Bay, when he is the representative with the Bay in the district. But his record on environment in general is not good. It's not good. They want to roll back these EPA regulations. I can't recall exactly, but he may be one of the handful of people who thinks the EPA simply shouldn't exist. What do you think happens if we're letting all this runoff get into the Bay?
So how do you think you're going to win over conservative voters? I mean, this is a very conservative district. It was actually drawn that way by Democrats and so redistricting.
I'm a small business owner, and what I do professionally is consult for the Department of Defense in acquisition streamlining. So it is my job to tell the federal government how to run their programs faster or cheaper, how to get around bureaucratic red tape. I understand fiscal responsibility, if not professionally, certainly as a single mother, where you have to learn how to stretch a dollar sometimes. I want us to have responsible use of our taxpayer dollars. And that does not include, say, voting against hurricane relief funding for your own district. That does not include cutting resources for your schools. That does not include cutting access to things like birth control. People can say, well, I don't want to pay for it. But for every dollar spent in providing free access to contraceptives, you save 6. We need policies that make sense. When I went to grad school, University of Maryland, it was for public policy. I believe in best practices in public policy. I believe in ethics, integrity, and responsible government, ethical government. Also, I believe that representatives need to remember that they work for everybody.
I'm going to turn to some of the constituencies, the farming community, the agriculture community. They're fairly conservative in terms of certainly their politics. How does your assessment of what Harris has done in terms of his policies, and what would you be doing differently?
Well, he voted against the farm bill for one, but I'd go out and I'd talk to them, and try and understand what are your specific concerns. What is it that you need? Are your small family farms being taken advantage of in the contract structures that you have with the larger farms? What is it that you need from us? Government ought to work for the person who can't afford to give a cent to a politician, not the person who's able to max out. I'm for the little guy. I would go out and talk to the small family farms, say, how can I help? What can we do? Another part of my job professionally is acquisition reform and how we do contracts. And I know how contracts should be properly structured. I know how contracts can be structured to exploit a smaller company that has no other option. What can we do to help you with those things? What can we do truly understanding what the impacts of the environmental regulations would be on you. How can we help you with that if we say you need to implement a more sustainable tactic for your farming techniques, things like that. And making sure that they know that somebody's there to listen, that we're going to get their input on everything, that we're going to take the time to understand the issues and do our due diligence. I think at the most basic level, we should be able to expect representatives to do their jobs, to read bills before they vote for them, to not just take a party stance. I consider it irresponsible. I think a lot of people would appreciate that.
You mentioned the fact that talking about people who have contracts, who are small farmers, a small business, as it were, that is certainly the motif, as it were, of the current poultry industry, in which there are a lot of farmers, a lot of growers of poultry. They're out there. They have these individual contracts with large folks who produce poultry, and sometimes there's inequity, sometimes there's not. Are you concerned about that? I mean, is that
Absolutely. So that was brought to my attention, and that was what I was referring to with the contracts where it was not fairly structured to benefit the small family farms. Everybody ought to be able to put in a hard day's work and earn a living and have enough money to get by and to be able to retire in peace and comfort with dignity. If we don't have structures of our contracts, if we don't have, and that's broader than that, it goes to all employment. If workers don't have those things available to them, then that is something that where we ought to be stepping in and making sure that the little guy is protected, that the person who is at a disadvantage in negotiating these things is protected, and make sure that people have what they need to get by, and that they're not being taken for a ride, I guess.
By the way, do you favor then that more unionization for people who are working in places?
I absolutely support collective bargaining rights. I think that we need to stop chipping away at our unions. I think that we need to make sure that labor is protected. I think that we need to hear them out and make sure that we're backing up our workers in terms of negotiating what kind of benefits they have, making sure that they have a safe working environment, making sure that they're protected in the way that they need. I will say, in a perfect world, employers would do these things and behave responsibly across the board, and there wouldn't be a need for it. But realistically, until that happens, if it ever happens, then you have to have unions.
I want to turn to the watermen, and certainly the Chesapeake Bay itself. A lot of local watermen, of course, feel put upon because of a lot of the restrictions that are going on. On the other hand, we have serious situation with Pennsylvania and the flow that's coming down the Susquehanna River. What would you be doing to try to, on the one hand, balance what the watermen need in terms of being able to harvest oysters and crabs as opposed to environmental restrictions?
Well, I think that we need to... pollution doesn't respect state boundaries. That is something that belongs up at the federal level and to be addressed up at the federal level. With regard to the watermen, you go out there and you talk to them and say, which regulations are you concerned about? Certainly pollution in the areas that they're trying to go crabbing or fishing, whatever it is, that's not going to help them. Nobody wants to be concerned about the quality of the food that they're eating. Nobody wants to have those issues. We also need to make sure that they have the visas that they need for the workers, for crab picking, things like that.
Speaking of immigration, what's your feeling about it? It's obviously a hot issue nationally, certainly important here on the shore, whether it's farming industry or more personally, perhaps the tourist industry. Where you are on that, what would you lobby for?
We need to have more responsible policies which are based in basic human decency and compassion. And then we shouldn't have local law enforcement operating as an extension of ICE. That kind of thing shouldn't be happening. People shouldn't be concerned to report a crime that happened in their community because of their immigration status. We need to make it easier for people to become citizens of the United States. I mean, if people want to come here and serve and pay taxes, what is the problem? These mass deportations are economic insanity. I mean, we are dependent on these people for a number of things. They contribute a huge amount of money each year in the country. But beyond that, going back to what Harris spends his time on with the reproductive rights, their immigration policies, the xenophobic immigration policies, are driving down our birth rates in the country, which is then causing problems across the board and encouraging them to push these other crazy policies where they, for instance, have redefined your hormonal birth control as an abortion, which is ridiculous. There are plenty of reasons to take birth control that are not specifically associated with birth. You know, women need to have access to the drugs that they need. I think they understand that this is sort of key to equality, and I don't the broader impacts of what we've been doing with our immigration policy. It's bad, and it's a big web of issues. The other thing is with regard to climate change. If we're not addressing climate change, then we are going to have more people trying to come here. You know, we need to be responsible with those types of things so that we can preemptively do something to address this instead of people crossing the border asking for refugee status and us violating their rights, which is what's happening right now.
Well, as a matter of fact, here off the coast, and particularly off of Ocean City, there is controversial proposals for wind farms, at least two of them anyway. The coastal folks, particularly in Ocean City, say they're concerned that they're going to be too close, that perhaps they don't want them at all. But obviously, wind is a key element, for instance, in dealing with climate change. Where are you in terms of whether or not, A, these things should be there, and B, what process, if there is to be needed for those things to be established?
Well, you know, there are other areas who have had similar projects, and you can see them, and it's about the size of a thumbnail on the ocean, and they've not had any dip in their tourism. It's in fact, in some ways, a draw to those communities and has brought in more money. Also, there's obviously the environmental impacts, the economic impacts. It brings in jobs. And we need to be transitioning to cleaner energy sources. And would you rather have an oil rig out there? Because Harris just barely stopped them from allowing to drill out there. You know, and that was because of an uproar from his constituents. I'm surprised he listened, because he normally doesn't. But I support the wind farm projects. Certainly, the constituents themselves, the area, the local residents should have a say in that, and representatives should be there to listen. But in this particular situation, Harris is going and messing with a project that Maryland already approved. I mean, this is just wasting money at this point over sort of silly things. And when you look into why is he doing it, well, it's about money.
By the way, how do you view U.S. military involvement abroad?
I would say, well, I will say this. I was married to a combat veteran for over a decade. I've raised children through a deployment where I had to explain to a 2.5-year-old who didn't understand where daddy was, Dad's going to come home, when I don't really know. And the only thing he would ever tell me is, look, I work on Blackhawks. They'll protect the Blackhawks because the Blackhawks are worth $30 million. You know, a person to the military is worth, what, $400,000, something like that. It was back then. And I also have worked for Department of Defense myself as a contractor or consultant for 10, 11 years now. We need to evaluate those things on a case-by-case basis. There are situations where it is appropriate for us to send some troops in, but we need to be smart about how we're going about that. You know, long-term presence in a lot of these regions is not necessarily a good idea. We shouldn't have people going over for 4, 5, 6 different deployments. It's impossible for them. There are long-lasting implications to their mental health, physical health. It impacts families, and it blows a ton of money. What are we doing? You need to be more careful with it. So I certainly wouldn't favor military intervention unless I saw it as absolutely necessary to, say, maintain peace in a region. And I would say that we should go in there with international partners and not be the only ones that are in there alone.
Well, let me stay along those lines. One of the most difficult foreign policy areas for certainly the Obama administration, certainly again now for the Trump administration, although they seem to have now made some decision, was Syria and what to do. What side was anyone on? And we had conflicting situations with our allies, the Turks, for example. Is that a kind of place we should get ourselves involved with militarily?
Well, what did they do the last time there was a chemical weapons attack? They struck 3 facilities,
right.
Correct?
Right.
I would say that was actually the right call. I mean, it wasn't populated areas, it was research and development facilities. If you're not dealing with these chemical weapon precursors, then they ultimately turn into chemical weapons, which are going to be used on their own people. I mean, that you cannot leave unaddressed. And we do have responsibilities to deal with biological and chemical warfare internationally. We have international agreements with regard to that. So we need to honor those and make sure our allies know that we're going to keep our word. We're going to step up to the plate when we need to. And I do think that it was appropriate that we went in there with international allies and did that and didn't do it in a vacuum. And that it was very targeted, very limited strike just to get at where they were keeping these chemical weapon precursors.
Well, along those lines, do you agree then with the Trump administration in terms of pulling back in terms of our involvement abroad?
That is the type of thing I would want to pull in the military advisors and local people who understand those issues very, very well and understand and assess on a case-by-case basis.
So what is your impression of how, from what we've seen of the impeachment process, all of its flaws, what do you think it says about how we govern?
I think it says that we don't have responsible government anymore, that we don't have rule of law anymore, that people who distrust government have every reason to distrust government. So divided, so partisan. Some things should not be a question of party. My bachelor's degree was in philosophy with a focus in ethics. I believe in truth. I believe in logic. I believe in things that make sense. Even in the Nixon era, we at least had people who were willing to acknowledge on both sides of the aisle that something was wrong. Now, I've not personally read the Mueller report, right? I'm not going to tell you that I have any reason to not believe it, that I have any reason to believe it. I'm inclined to think that they did their due diligence in making sure that they documented all of those things very thoroughly. But something I can tell you is that if Andy Harris is commenting on that report within 3 minutes of it being released to Congress, he didn't read it. He doesn't know what's in it. He doesn't care what the truth is. And what was it, Amash, who broke away and said, this is absolutely right, that I am horrified by what's in this report, that there's no reason to question it, and that crimes were committed. Just, if this were private industry, if it were anything else, if it were private industry, these people would have been fired for gross incompetence by now.
By the way, are you concerned about what occurred with the Ukraine situation, with the offering, as it were, it appears anyway, of assistance and a meeting, White House meeting in return for some kind of announcement of investigation? One
of my biggest things, going back to my always caring about ethics, my always caring about things making sense, is I think probably the number one thing that I would do in Congress is implement anti-corruption legislation, and to, in a perfect world, and you'd hope people would agree with this, an overhaul of our campaign system. And not just finance, making it easier, public financing of campaigns, making it easier for people to run. You shouldn't be able to buy an election either. What you're trying to do in Congress is not about how much money you can raise. What you're trying to do in Congress is how responsibly can you spend a taxpayer's dollar. Our electoral system is giving you people who have the exact opposite skill set. I would like to cap the amount of funding that you can spend on an election. I think that's the only thing that's going to allow everyday people to get in there. And diversity of perspective is important because people prioritize. This is just human nature, basic human nature. People prioritize the issues that they know best, whether it's personal to them because they lived it or it's an issue with their mother. Case in point, Barbara Mikulski pushed some elder care legislation, but she did not do it until her own father got sick. There are certain types of people who are going to have issues running for office. It's going to be harder for them, more barriers for them. For instance, in my case, I'm a single mother. I got into this, shortly after my own mother had passed away. My dad is not in great health. It's all these things coming at me, in life, and I'm certainly not independently wealthy. I'm not going to be able to go out there and buy an election. But I understand issues that average working Americans are living. Whereas somebody who is a millionaire and is just going to pay for home care and these things are not a concern, does not know what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck, is going to prioritize the things that are an issue to them. And it's not going to be the same set of issues. So your perspective and your experience are dictating your priorities, and your priorities are dictating what you're going to go in there and fight for. We need diversity in the House of Representatives, the House closest to the people in particular, because if your perspective is not in there, you're not being served. And we don't need to look any farther than the people who've been left behind by the government all these years to see that this is true, or what a very homogenous group of people who share the same similar set of issues are going to focus on while ignoring everything else because maybe in their experience they're not even aware this problem exists. That's not serving everybody. We need to make sure that anybody who would make a good member of Congress, a good representative, any level of elected office as a matter of fact, has the opportunity and the tools and resources that they need in order to do that. And we need also to make sure that our electorate is better informed, because most people keep asking me, how does Andy Harris win? I canvass door to door all the time. I've met maybe one person who likes him, and that was regardless of party, if they knew what he was doing. And the only conclusion that I can draw based on that is that most people don't know who their representative is, never mind what they do. I mean, even my local Republicans are saying, oh, well, I'll vote for Hogan, but that guy's awful. We need to make sure that people are invested in our government, that people understand why they need to participate, that people understand the importance of their vote. We need to end things like gerrymandering, which make you question whether your vote matters at all. Every vote should matter. Maybe we need to look at ranked choice voting instead of our current primary systems. Look at different ways of doing things and overhauling it, and also having ethics legislation saying, hey, you can't own millions of dollars of stocks in an industry you're elected to go regulate. This is this is public service. It's not a get-rich-quick scheme. These people need to remember who they work for. Maybe we need to make it easier to get rid of some of them, too, if they don't want to do their jobs. Clean out your war chest every couple of years.
Well, we've been speaking with Allison Galbraith. She is running for Congress in the 1st District, and she hopes to challenge Republican incumbent Andy Harris. Second time around, we'll see how it all goes. I appreciate you stopping by and chatting with us this morning.
Thank you very much.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net. or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. You can also watch Delmarva Today on PAC 14 by tuning into Comcast Channel 14 or youtube.com/PAC 14.